welcome everybody to this key session of the Primadonna Festival. If we want to think about the world as it should be, then what we need to do is listen and learn. And that's why these two books are so very, very exciting. This session is called On Being Other. And it's a great honour and a huge excitement to me when I was offered this session. I took Catherine's hand off. I was like, oh, yes, please. I was so excited to read these books. So I'm very delighted to introduce Monique Roffey, the multi-award-winning writer, British Trinidadian writer who writes across genres. Her most recent glory is this book, The Mermaid of Black Conch, winner of the Costa Prize and available in the bookshop after this event. It's an absolutely stunning piece of literature. Treat yourself. Monique is also active with Extinction Rebellion. She's an educator at Manchester Met and at the National Writers' Centre, and more on that later. May I also introduce Natalie Morris. She is a was a print and broadcast journalist focusing on race and on identity with a background in news covering marginalised communities. Her book, Mixed Other, explores multiraciality in modern Britain. And again, it's a very exciting piece of writing. And I think the best way to explore these, because on the face of it, what we're looking at is an astonishing, glittery, dark, twisty fairy tale and a powerful, urgent piece of non-fiction. So you would think there'd be no interplay, but in fact there is. But what I want to do is to give a sense of each book to you as an audience. So we'll start by talking about yours, Natalie, if that's fine, and have an exploration of her book, then an exploration of Monique's, and then wind it into a conversation. Please come closer, quickly text your friends, tell them it's their last chance to see the defining moment of the entire festival. So Natalie, this book is really exciting. Can I say it's really brave as well, because you put a lot of yourself into it. I'm delighted to know that your sister, the famous Becky, is right here. Let me ask you though, there's an amazing quote right at the beginning, and I want to just dive straight into the uncomfortable places. I'm quoting, "As I've said, I identify as black and mixed. For me, it is possible and necessary to be both."
Yes. Yeah, for me, I think that the kind of importance of self-identifying is something that's kind of paramount when you're a mixed person, when you have mixed identity, because so often you are told what you are and what you are not by other people. It's kind of projected onto you. And that can be an incredibly disempowering thing to have happen to you on a frequent and very regular basis. So I think what I really wanted to kind of convey was the urgency of giving that power back to people, back to individuals who have that lived experience. And it is so incredibly different for every person. You can't say that to be mixed is to be one thing. There are so many different things. And in the book, I speak to, between 20 and 30 people with different mixed heritages. And there are so many things that overlap in our experiences, but also so many crucial differences that are very dependent on context, on our age, on where we grew up, on the kind of heritage that we have. And you can't erase those differences by just putting us all in one mixed box, and that just flattens it. So for me to say that at the beginning of the book, to say that I am black and mixed, I think is very important to give people the power to be both, to tick multiple boxes, to tick no boxes, to live in between the boxes. And that's kind of what the whole book is about, and there is power in those in-between spaces.
And boxes matter more than, as a white person, that can be so invisible to the white gaze. And, even just a small thing like noticing recently on the NHS website where you put your test in, your COVID test, they've shuffled the boxes around because it used to always say at the top, white British. It just by default, whiteness was the top of the pile. And you talk about that.
Yeah, I think that's how we always talk about race. Whiteness is the default and everybody else kind of spirals out from that. And I think that that's what we really need to kind of destabilize and undermine when we are talking about race. And I think the only way to do that is to decenter whiteness wherever we can. We don't have to talk about race in a way that focuses on whiteness as the beginning and everybody else is other, everybody else is something on a sliding scale below that. And I think that what I do in this book is to try and look at the different areas that exist beyond whiteness, outside of it completely. There's a whole chapter on people who are mixed without white heritage, and I think that's a really important part, and a category that's often completely erased from the conversation of mixedness, because so often when we're talking about being mixed, we're talking about it in relation to your white heritage. We're talking about, okay, what's the proximity to whiteness, or how do your white family feel about having a non-white person? What racism have you experienced from your white family? And these are important conversations to have, but they're not the only conversations. And when we keep circling back to those elements of it, we're just kind of reinforcing this hierarchy where whiteness is the most important thing and the only way we can talk about race. So I think it's really powerful to talk about race that doesn't involve white people, doesn't involve the white gaze at all.
Absolutely. And another thing that came very powerfully out of this is the idea of race as a binary and overcoming that binary. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very inherent in even the language of around mixedness. And I talk at the beginning that we don't have perfect language to do with race at all, but particularly about mixedness. I mean, I've settled on mixed because it's something that is familiar to me, but I think it's imperfect. Because I think, again, it suggests that people are, there are binaries of race that can be combined like ice cream flavors, that can be swirled together. And I think that to do that really kind of limits our understanding of what else people can be and what else can exist beyond one or the other. Because I think that is quite... again, just limiting in terms of your identity and feeling as though if you're not one thing or the other, if you don't fit into these pre-existing categories that people have in their heads, that's when it's a problem. That's when people project their discomfort onto you. That's when they start demanding you tell them where you're really from and explain your face, explain why you're brown, explain why you don't fit in their mind. So, yeah.
And you talk about how exhausting that is, and you talk also about Meghan Markle.
Yeah. Well, that is an exhausting conversation as a mixed person in the media this year and the last couple of years.
It's just a really hilarious scene where you're brought in to talk about the wedding and you go off in your own direction. It's very funny.
Yeah, I mean, I did not play ball with what the BBC producers wanted that day. So I was invited to the wedding, not actually in the church. I was just like outside, obviously, but doing some commentary on the radio, talking about what it means to have a mixed princess. What does that mean for inclusivity? What does it mean for modern Britain? And I was basically like, it means nothing. It doesn't mean that it was kind of presented as this progressive step forward. Like,
we've got there.
Yeah, this is such a huge positive step. And I basically was saying, I don't think that is correct. I think actually, the royal family are an increasingly archaic institution and irrelevant. I saw...
Yeah. Can we talk about her dress?
Exactly, and the BBC, the presenter was a bit like, okay, let's cut to somebody else. And and I saw one of the program editor was commenting on his iPad, and I saw it over his shoulder, and they were like, don't talk about her, don't talk about that with her anymore, like keep it light. And the next question was about Meghan's dress, and I was like, this isn't really my area of expertise.
One of the other really exciting elements of the book is your exploration of the idea of fetishization of mixed appearance, be it IKEA adverts or the way that people respond to you and your sister at that family group, a really horrific description of the woman who liked you at a certain distance and then realised that you were part of it, couldn't comprehend that.
Yeah.
And also, you explore this, and I think it's very courageously done, because you don't just interview 20 people, you really examine your own reactions and people's reactions to your reactions. When people say, God, you're so tall and beautiful, what is actually happening there?
It's a really difficult one, isn't it? Because it's very hard to sit here and complain about people telling you that you're beautiful or exotic or all of these things. But, obviously, the heart underneath all of that, you've got to question where that's coming from. You've got to question why are mixed people and people with very specific mixed aesthetics suddenly being kind of pedestalized as this example of a beauty ideal at this moment in time, because it hasn't always been that way. It wasn't that way when I was growing up as a teenager, that, the elements of my blackness that are visible on me were things I wanted to minimize when I was younger because it wasn't in vogue, it wasn't the thing. Now suddenly we're plastered on billboards and we're, you know, in shop windows and we're on every advert. And you know, there's a tendency to see that again is a positive step forward. Okay, we're moving towards this more diverse, inclusive space. But actually, there's a very specific form of kind of racial ambiguity that is trendy. It's a trend. And when that trend isn't just a haircut or a fashion, when it's something that's inherent to your identity, then that's really problematic because trends are fleeting. And what happens when that goes out of style? And really, what's happening is there's a kind of a palatability that is in fashion. There's a proximity to whiteness. It's a very specific aesthetic that is black but not too black, different but not too different, other but not too other, not too far away from what people feel comfortable with. So we tick a box without challenging people too much.
And it's also being monetized in the same way that, you know, banks all got their pride flags up, and you know, and it's, you know, what kind of gesture is that ultimately if they're profiting from the optics?
Exactly. I mean, it's entirely superficial, and you know, to have people who look like me, for example, on billboards and on adverts, they're just the faces of these organizations. They're not given a voice. They're just literally being used to make a company look good in a particular time when people are putting black squares on Instagram and trying to make a point about their institution. But when you look behind the closed doors and you look at who is making the money, it'll be a very different picture. It'll be a boardroom full of old white men who are actually profiting off non-white faces, essentially.
And I just want to say this is Natalie's first appearance in real life, so can we just have a completely massive round of applause for no other reason than this is her first one that's not been on Zoom, so hooray for real audiences in the real world. Thanks for sharing that. I want to talk now about The Mermaid of Black Conch, which is an extraordinary book with echoes perhaps of Garcia Marquez and maybe even Hemingway, although it's kind of an anti-Hemingway in my mind. It's been described in all sorts of very lavish terms. A unique talent, Bernardine Evaristo. What's the story of the writing of this book? Where did it come from?
Well, it came from that old myth. It came from this old myth that I found about so the story is a rewrite of an old ancient legend, and in the legend, a pretty young woman who's getting too much attention from men is first banished and then properly witched, properly cursed by a witch into eternal exile to live as a mermaid, and with her goes a crone, an older woman, who is turned into a turtle. So it's kind of like old woman cursed, young woman cursed. Really interesting. Like, I don't know. I mean, I remember being a really young woman, and I remember I probably used to piss quite a lot of other women off. So there's something about getting womanhood right, and female jealousy and the patriarchy, and there's so much there that I felt needed rewriting and revisiting. And also the woman, as a mermaid, is sealed up inside their tail, so she's banished from her sexuality as well.
And there's a strong theme of an almost a gendering of the natural world at various levels. But there's a particularly incredibly powerful opening scene when the white fishermen and then the local fishermen that they employ, they go out to capture this legendary creature, and they fight for hours, and they drag her on board. And there's a horrific scene of the sexual response that causes in them. It's very rapey. She's damaged and bleeding, and they all want to fuck her.
Yeah. Okay. Well, lots going on there. She would have a lot of energy, a lot of powerful goddess energy. I wanted her to be really big, and they're dragging Aphrodite, Kali, Shakti. They're dragging a momentous goddess out of the water, the likes of which they cannot contemplate. And I don't know if any of you have been near big mountains. The energy you get off a big mountain, it's like it does produce energy in you, like a type of arousal. I wanted her to have that kind of woof, utter, they want to fuck her. There's also a really famous poem by Pablo Neruda, who famously raped, I think, a servant, about a young woman who also is cursed to be a mermaid, loses her tail, finds her way up onto land, walks into a bar for help, and the bar is full of men, and they violate her. I've always thought about that poem. There's something of that poem in that's manifest in this scene where they just want to fuck her and dominate her. It's not an easy scene to read.
It was incredibly powerful, actually. Yeah. There's an important history of indigeneity worked through the book as well.
Yeah.
Can you tell us something about that layering?
God, that's another long, complicated thing.
I'll give you a minute and a half.
So Mermaid Mythology, Mermaidology, is, I think, around about, I've traced it back to about 3,000 years, so pre-Christian, and of course, brown people are the global majority. Many of these mermaids would have been indigenous, no matter where they are in the world. So the first mermaid story I've come across happened in Assyria, in a goddess called Atagaris, who killed her lover during lovemaking, squashed him to death, and threw herself into a river, into a lake, but the gods fished her out, turned her into a mermaid, let her live. But what's so fascinating about mermaids is they're ancient, they're eponymous, they're indigenous all over. They have to be indigenous. They're pre-Christianity, pre-Judaism, so many of our organised methodologies, pre-whiteness, pre-white supremacy, pre-everything. So then there's the fact that we had a Holocaust of sorts of indigenous people perpetrated by, all through the Americas, all through the North America, South America, and the Caribbean, where the Spanish came and killed everyone, and tortured people into Christianity, and not enough was made of this. And Columbus came, and what's interesting is that he brought priests with him, and the Columbus ships had a cross on them, because they were bringing Christ to the natives. And one of these priests was so horrified by what he saw the Spanish doing that he wrote it all down. And that's all we've got in our region of what the conquistadors did. In 50 years, 6 million were decimated. And some of these people, their ancestors, are still alive, but in very small pockets of in the Northern Antilles, throughout the region. So I am bringing into the book that she comes from these people, but when she comes back and is fished out and is a woman again, she's like, where are they all? Everybody's black. What happened? And so she also has to come to terms with the fact that her people have been genocided. Yeah.
It's also really fun. I'm just kidding. And then moving forwards through subsequent populations of the islands and the history of the islands, there's and it speaks to the theme of mixed people.
Yeah.
There's the character of Miss Rain and her relationship and her child.
Yeah.
Miss Rain's a really compelling character. Can you? And the sort of liberation that she experiences at the end, relinquishing of the property. And, yes, please tell us a bit about her character and her life.
Our canon, our regional canon in the Caribbean, is dominated by Jean Rhys. My identity is also really strange. Most Caribbean white people are complicated, but our canon is dominated by a mad white woman. And her madness is, I think, connected to trauma. But she is someone I feel, I'm not comfortable with women being mad generally. And I wanted to write a white character who I felt I knew more and who felt contemporary and who wasn't mad, but who was inherently mixed up in a very problematic way into the culture and the lives of these people. And her own curse is the history of her people, of the crimes her people have perpetrated, and her isolation, her love affair, the way she is interconnected and at the one point dominant, but at the same time trying to be benevolent, and at the same time definitely in love with a childhood, a hero or sweetheart who abandons, so she's mixed up in this. So that's how I know people like her. I know more than one woman who I've based her on. So, and I just wanted to sort of banish yes, there are remnants of the plantocracy still in the region, of course, and I'm not trying to, rewrite what their families have, their lineage, were responsible for. But I'm really interested in how they are not separate. They're part of things. Yeah.
And in a similar way, going beyond the structural racism and patriarchy, there is also the othering between women as well, and the voices of the women that come in the storm at the end, that the hurricane takes female form, and female vengeance is a powerfully destructive force on the characters.
Well, there is something about ill will between women, and I'm interested in magic generally, sympathetic magic, and when you reverse that, and I think in the book I say, be careful when you wish people ill, and when you say bad things sometimes, and then guess what, the next thing, bad things happen, and it's incredible how you can wish someone ill, and that person can fall ill, and so in this story, they get a witch to do some really big harm that can't be reversed. So the voices are an ancient kind of voices of the witches who cursed her, and she doesn't really get to escape them. She goes back. But there is a lot about intersectionality, black women, white women, small village, who's running, who's powerful. I know someone like Priscilla in every small village, whether this is a village of white people or black people, there's always somebody who's quite scary, and who's you want to keep on the right side of.
Priscilla's a very terrifying person who wears pink curlers in her hair, and she basically she's doomed when she comes a knocking, isn't she?
Yeah, she's scary, and also there's this idea of monetarization of the outsider, the half-human. Which is Aikaia the mermaid, who immediately, wanted to bring up the subject of, who's selling who, the fact that she's more fish than woman to them and easily dehumanized and worth a lot of money.
And by the same token, she's dehumanized, but as with that the optics of othering, she's also incredibly beautiful and powerful, but in a monetized sense. So the way that her beauty is described is so lavish and so other. It's part of the attraction, obsession.
I hoped that I have not sort of exoticized a brown woman, because I wanted her to have to just be different, and to have a consciousness that was almost shamanic, and to understand nature, to be very close to nature. And so when David tries to sort of seduce her, or, David's just falls completely in love with her. This is the fisherman that rescues her. He doesn't know what to do. He can't make the usual romantic gestures towards her, because she's not reading the room in the same way that he's reading the room, and so he just has to wait for him to be picked by her. And again, there's something about the Cupid and Psyche myth that I want to flip, where in that myth, it's the virgin, the young woman, who's waiting to be deflowered by Eros. And there's a scene in the book where the mermaid takes agency over her first night of sexual, her first night with a man sexually. She steps into this and takes charge. So I wanted to work with so many things here.
There are so many things to work with in this tale. It's extraordinary. I want to return to the idea of othering that you've both tackled from such different directions. Can we talk about how different genres are a tool for exploring that, and what your actual, if you have a purpose in writing, because you're an educator, your work is, you're a communicator. Are you teaching people?
I don't think that teaching was my main purpose, or is my main purpose with my writing and with this book. I think it was more about reflecting reality in a more empathetic way than we often get in mainstream spaces, because I think there's a lot of power in that, and people need it. Because I was writing about these topics and about mixed identity as a journalist for quite a while before I wrote the book, and so much of the feedback was getting emails and DMs from mixed people who were saying, thank you for showing me that I'm not alone with these feelings, with these kind of the conflicts and the feeling of not belonging that can come when you have mixed identity and mixed backgrounds of all different kinds. And just to see those stories reflected was incredibly powerful for them and for me. And so for me, it was more about filling a hole, because reading stories and getting that kind of nod of recognition that you're not alone in these feelings, that weird thought that you've got in your own head doesn't mean you're mad, doesn't mean you're having your own little mini breakdown that nobody else understands, that you've got to deal with on your own. To pick up a book or to read an article where somebody's articulating that very specific experience that you thought was just your own has been some of the most transformational, important moments of my life when I found those things, and so helpful. So I wanted to give that for other people, essentially.
And you were writing it under lockdown, which sort of it deepened that sense of isolation. So in connecting to other people, that's very powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, writing a book in lockdown whilst also having a full-time job was an absolute madness. It was so hard, but also incredibly useful to be able to do these interviews and to talk to these people. Like it was cathartic for me, and I learned so much about mixed identity and more than I thought, because I only have my own narrow prism of my own experiences. And the whole point of the book is that it's so much more than that there isn't one story of mixedness. So it was amazing to talk to all these different people and learn so much and reevaluate so many of my own ideas about my identity.
So the story of mixedness and the story of otherness, Monique, how do you see books going out and changing the world? What is the power of a novel?
Most writers can only hope to be read. I like what you said about this nuance, like writing with empathy and compassion, going carefully forward and putting forward what you know. It's all I can say is this is how the world feels according to me, and I can only offer how I think the world feels and looks. And people have responded to this book. They're like, "Oh God, you've been so funny. You've been so daring. I didn't know anything about Taino women. I didn't know this. I didn't know that." And because I think finally I just sort of like stopped worrying about maybe saying something that wasn't correct politically, or because I know this interesting world called Trinidad and Tobago, or Trinidad, where everybody's brown. People are very, very complex backgrounds. You can't take, people are related by blood or marriage, generally. Everyone knows everybody. People racialize you all the time. It's not a taboo. You can't, they say things that here are a little bit politically correct, and you hear it all the time. And I thought, you know what, I'm just going to write what I know and just get on with it.
So was that very liberating?
Yeah, and people are like, oh, it's really funny and it's great. And and I'm like, well, yeah, kind of. I mean, at one point I say there's a black character saying, "I'm gonna shoot your black ass." That's the kind of thing you would hear people racializing. You hear people say things like this all the time in the Caribbean, and I just got to the stage where I just thought, I'm just gonna do what I do. I know what I know.
Do you think there's a role for stealth politics though in a work of fiction, a fairy tale?
For self-politics?
Stealth politics, getting a message of overcoming otherness, about diversity, about fluidity. of our existences?
I hope so. I don't think I feel like I'm trying to teach anyone anything or educate people, because it's kind of the opposite of that. I've told a story. There's the word entertaining on the cover. I like that. I actually like that word. Am I trying to say what I think? Well, I'm trying to say what I think. Yeah.
Because
both
both books respond so powerfully to the political landscape of now, which, let's face it, is compromised, fraught, stressful, hostile, and mad in many ways. You know, we're in a political landscape of deep divisions, and both works, I think, come at this.
Well, just one thing I wanted to say. I'm 20 years older than you, and so I think when I was your age, I wouldn't be on the stage here talking like this. So I think I kept my head down, did not talk about my identity, acted white, pretended I was white, embraced whiteness, tried to be white, straightened my hair, endured many things that women of colour endure, about my looks, the way I look, who am I, where am I from, all these things I just swept under the carpet. I just got on with being a white woman as best I could. And I really embrace the fact that I'm up here now with you, younger woman, and I don't care how fraught it is now. At least if it's fraught, but eventually it'll get better.
And you talk about passing, don't you? Can you?
Just to add to that though, I think it's brilliant that we are having these conversations now, and though it is fraught, they are so vital, and in terms of it being an education, I think that is, I feel very encouraged by the fact that people seem to want to be educated and want to learn in this moment that we're in, and that's been something that's been brilliant. And I wrote this book before the Black Lives Matter summer started. It was already in process as yours was, exactly. And I think a lot of people assume that it's a reaction, and that you're kind of, obviously there's a kind of plethora of these anti-racist books and these guidelines, and people are publishing all these reading lists, and these are the things you've got to read if you want to be an anti-racist ally. And
there's a book now called What White People Should Do Next, or something.
Yeah, Emma Dabbery's book, which is...
Is it?
It's an amazing book.
Yeah,
it's an amazing. And these books, I think, have so much power within them. But I think it's not necessarily on the authors to be educators. I think it's on people to figure out what they don't know, and then go and find out how they need to know that, and not through a simple guide. You can't read one book and be like, cool, tick, done. I know how to be an anti-racist now. It's an ongoing journey, and that you're going to read fiction, non-fiction. You have to have conversations with people, real people. So it's much broader than just reading a guidebook, I think.
And I want to bring you back to the point about passing,
Yes.
which you just brought up, and which is a really powerful part of your book. Can you tell us a bit more?
Yeah, so, there's a whole chapter about people with mixed heritage who pass as white, and I do this because I think, it's an inherently kind of problematic term steeped in all this kind of strange and dark history, where people kind of had to survive by pretending to be white and passing into that world if they were able to, in terms of how they looked and their skin colour, and they were able to move into those spaces. And it's a very different thing now.
What cost does it come at to the individual?
Well, in a modern day sense, so there are people I speak to in the book who have black heritage, or Indian heritage, or whatever it is, but to other people are perceived as white, are racialized as white people. And the people I spoke to, it's a really quite hard thing to feel like that side of your heritage has been erased. And often people want to try and claim that, and almost feel like they're overcompensating by really trying to like shoehorn into the conversation, like, oh yeah, because I am Indian actually, like because of my dad, and it feels like this really awkward conversation that you have to prove your heritage, which is very strange, because not something that I have any experience of, because I'm clearly non-white, and my heritage is very visible. But I spoke to people who have technically very, very similar mixes to me, who look completely different, and that's part of of the complexity of mixedness is how different people can look, and the implications of how you're racialized is so tied up in your physical appearance. And it kind of throws up the fallacy of race as a whole, doesn't it? When, you know, someone can have the exact same heritage as me and have a completely different experience of being racialized. You know?
I mean, it is for me something about your appearance, which is so reductive. When I was young, I went to boarding school when I was 12, and I used to speak with a Trinidadian accent, a strong West Indian accent, and I ditched that accent quite quickly, because I would open my mouth and they're like, what are you trying to imitate Bob Marley or something? You know, what? They'd like laugh at me sometimes. It's like white girls at school. And was really problematic. For a couple of years, I'd go home, spend, you know, the Creole would come back into my voice. I'd come back from autumn term. And they're like, ha ha ha, you're doing it again. You're talking like a Rasta. Stop doing it. And I'd be like, I had to just stop doing it.
So you othered yourself.
I didn't know what was going on. It was terrible. And you see a lot of white Caribbean people with this black voice. It's not a black voice, it's a Caribbean voice. And everybody speaks it. Everybody does. The different islands have different accents. Jamaican accent and Bajan accent and Trinidad, they're not the same. It's like, you know. But white Caribbean people have this problem, and it's also my awareness. Like, I've grown up in a post-colonial country, I get it, and I'm also 1%, so that's uncomfortable. And I understand what it means to be white from a place where white people did a lot of bad things. So so your mixedness isn't just about what you look like. It's so reductive. It's about your cultural awareness and positioning, and who you know yourself to be. And I've had so many people try to tell me who they think I am. And I'm like, this is not your call. You don't get to tell me who I am. I know who I am. It's complicated, really complicated.
Did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And I think it comes back down to that thing of labeling and the power that comes in your own identity. I said before, being mixed is people telling you where you belong and where you don't belong, and telling you what you are and what you're not. And pushing back against that, I think, is really important.
I just wanted to ask, sometimes I think to myself, actually, when someone says where you're from, to be honest, it's a really interesting story. It's complicated. And I wish I felt happy to talk about it in a positive way. I wish that question, it shouldn't be something that you feel a bit closed down about. It should be actually, that's half an hour there, I could tell you, you know.
I think it's more where that question comes from for me. I talk about it in the book. It's something that almost every single person who's mixed, who I spoke to, they're like, oh yeah, when people ask you where are you from, no, where are you really from? And it's very much about what's behind that question. Because for some, like, if it depends on the context. So if you were asking me, for example, and it comes from a place of actual curiosity and being able to relate to that, then obviously you're going to be happy to talk about it and want to. But so often it's not about that. So often it's this kind of demand that you explain yourself, almost from the moment you meet somebody as well. It's very quick. It's like the first thing they ask you before they ask you anything else. They're like, oh no, where are you from? And you're like, somehow I've met you 10 seconds ago and now I'm talking about my grandmother and where she lives, and I have so many answers. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm from Manchester. Oh no, oh okay, but I live in London. Oh, you want to know where my dad's from? Oh, he's from Portsmouth. Oh, you want to know where his parents are from? And I'm like, okay, when you really pick it apart like that, I think it flips it back onto them. They have to then think, why do I need to know this? Actually?
It absolutely does. And there's a really key piece of data in the opening of the book. For all the IKEA adverts, 1 in 6 people asked were uncomfortable with the idea of people marrying outside of their own racial divisions. 1 in 6.
Yeah, it's very much not in my backyard type.
Yeah.
And I think that really is shown up in that. I think that's a very scary stat.
Yeah,
for now.
My eyes popped out when I read that. I'm just going to ask one more question, then I'd like to come out to the audience for questions. I wanted to return to the theme of non-binary in both of your works because I found it really exciting, and it caused me to reflect. Often at in festivals, people complain a lot about social media because being trolled, whatever. But I think social media for, my kids are sort of Gen Z and below, and for them on Insta and TikTok, there's and just thinking about mermaids and shifting identities, and there's so many sort of transformations, and just the technology of changing your appearance is a really exciting and fluid thing. Both of your books come towards this theme. Would you like to comment on the non-binary in your work?
Yeah, I think that fluidity is a really nice word, and definitely a theme that I want to kind of push forward in the book. And yeah, it comes back to this kind of idea about the categories and existing in these in-between spaces, and what it means to push back against the binarization, if that's a word, of race, essentially, because it is very much a sliding scale of black and white, and I think that is such a reductive and simplistic concept that really flattens the complexity of what actually exists on the spectrum of being racialized and what else can exist. And again, it's this discomfort of other people when you don't fit into one of these binary categories. And it's the same, and I think it really crosses over between with gender and sexuality as well. And a lot of the feedback I've had from the book is people saying, I really relate to a lot of the themes as a gay man, for example, or as a non-binary person, or as a trans person. And this idea of existing between socially constructed categories, because race is socially constructed like gender and sexuality.
So the tyranny of these categorizations are being sort of challenged and undermined.
And we're seeing so much of a push towards allowing the freedom for people who exist with it beyond these simple categories, and I think race is part of that conversation.
Monique?
Yeah. Well, I just echo everything that you're saying. The other thing, I was just thinking, I don't have children, but I have godchildren, and my mother is 90 and I'm 56, so my mum, me, it's like 100 years. And the other day I was talking to my mum, and she said, I've just been watching The Queen's Gambit, it's so good. And I went, oh yeah, it is good, it's brilliant. Yeah, she says, what, is she a lesbian? And it just flew like a bullet over my head, because I thought, how am I, where do you start? I mean, it is a benchmark above in generationally, that how could my mother live for 90 years? And she wasn't a particularly straight, woman, and not ever really necessarily, I mean, she had probably quite a conservative, like housewife type life, and she was young in the 60s. I'm like, but to ask that question at the end of her life, and she loves watching television, she absolutely gobbles up tons of news and politics, and to still not understand, the spectrum of sexualities is something that I think about when I think about one of my goddaughters who's openly gender fluid, openly non-binary, openly queer, and out there on Instagram. Today I'm this, she's changed her name, she's changed everything, and she's 21.
The iconography of the mermaid is a very powerful...
She's a queer, I would say, embodies queerness because she's ambiguous and, fluid, definitely fluid. So I think I'm really, really, I feel a certain amount of positivity and confidence that we're heading in the right direction. So.
Heading in the right direction.
Yeah.
I'm going to head in the direction of some questions now. We've got the valiant Rob who's going to gallop around amongst you. Thank you, Rob, with a microphone. Like that. Questions for Monique and Natalie, please. Just keep your hand up.
I've heard a lot of authors this weekend talk about relatability in their writing, both in their kind of fears about commerciality of commercial viability. To what extent do you think that actually social progress might be furthered when people start reading things they can't relate to and about experiences that are different to theirs? And where do you think we're at with that progress? Do you think we're getting there?
That's such a good question. I think it's interesting because people ask me a lot who my book is for, And I think, you know, my instinct is, oh yeah, it's for mixed people. Like, I want mixed people to read this. And I think first and foremost I do because it's the book that I wanted to read when I was younger. But also, I really, really, really want white people to read this book, and people who don't have mixed kids or a mixed partner or a black partner, who aren't in an interracial relationship, who don't necessarily have that natural personal point of contact, who would just want to open their minds to something they don't necessarily know about and wouldn't necessarily come across. I don't know where we are with that. I hope we're moving towards that, and I think the kind of the push towards pushing these like anti-racist books and opening, people are, I think, more willing to broaden their horizons in that way. So I think we're moving towards that. I hope so. What do you think?
If I had wanted to be commercial and make lots of money, I would have been writing genre fiction. I've been writing for 20 years. A long time ago, I would have been making more money because you're giving people what they want. You're giving crime writers, crime readers what they want, all the tropes, everything, historical romance, this, that, the other. When you write into genre, you give people what they want. So I never wrote that in the first place. So I've been in this kind of margin, writing whatever I want, and hoping for the best and just thinking, well, I'm human, so there must be a few other humans out there. But with The Mermaid, I'm already taking the whole book out of the realm of realism. So again, it was a big risk. You could just alienate at least 50% of your readers by writing a book about a mermaid. I mean, particularly adult readers, you know, it might even get kicked into young adult fiction or something, or fantasy, or blah, blah. So I guess I'm really glad that that hasn't happened, and that does say something, that it is reaching an adult market and a literary market, and it's not being pigeonholed as some wookie rubbish that, you know, only wookie people might want to read. Yeah.
Costa Book of the Year, no less. Any more questions? Really? Oh, yes, please.
Hello. I think maybe a question for Natalie, I'm afraid. I'd love to read your book. It sounds really fascinating. And it seemed to me to have a lot of overlap. So I don't know if you've read David Baddiel's Jews Don't Count. So there's a whole section in that about, you know, ethnicity monitoring forms. And that's the experience that I have every time I open one of those. I'm Ashkenazi Jewish. Is there a box for Ashkenazi Jewish? There's been Ashkenazi Jews in this country for hundreds of years, but no box. And it feels to me, I mean, I just wonder if that's something that you've perceived as a kind of overlap with between what you're writing about people who are mixed, who don't fit into categories, and who are sort of invisible in one way, it sounds from what you said, and Jewish people who are ethnically diverse, but somehow, in that sense, invisible.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting, and I haven't read David Baddiel's book, but I've heard a lot about it, and it sounds really interesting. I think it's a really complex kind of area to talk about in terms of the crossover between Jewishness and race and ethnicity and where all those different lines are. And I don't have the expertise to speak on that in any
well, neither should
real
you.
sense.
I mean,
yeah,
you know, you
exactly.
can't write for every single
exactly.
everything.
Yeah,
Let's be fair.
but no, in terms of feeling erased from those forms, feeling as though you don't have a box to tick, feeling as though why do you need to have a box to tick for your own experience? There's definite overlaps there, and I think there's overlaps for anybody who feels as though they exist in slightly different spaces. And I've had a lot of feedback from people who are first and second generation immigrants, for example, who are British but have like Nigerian parents or Indian parents, and they're kind of traversing this space between Britishness and their parents' heritage, even though they're not mixed, but they have very similar experiences of belonging in two worlds and feeling like that experience isn't necessarily represented. So I do think there is huge overlap. Yeah.
We've probably got time for another question. Whilst you're arranging to put your hands up with your... Oh, there is one here, yes.
Working, yes. I wasn't going to say anything, but it actually follows on from something that our friend here said about invisible mixedness. My best friend's father arrived in the UK as a child during World War I, and he was Jewish. He knew he was Jewish, but he had no memory of his parents and didn't know what his history was. And he went back to work in Europe during World War II and married an East Prussian woman who, and they then both came back and settled in the UK. So there's this whole kind of post-war discrimination went on, and my friend and her brother were born in the 40s and have lived through that. But she now doesn't actually quite know who she is. And so she knows she's mixed race, mixed European race, but nonetheless very mixed race. But she can't, because she can't trace her history. That's an invisible mixedness that leaves her kind of confused. It's not a question really, it's just a comment on, I think there are lots of people out there.
Yeah, I'd like to reply to that, because I had my DNA tested last year because I had this thing about, you know, people telling me who I was all the time. You're white, you're black, you're mixed race, who are you, what are you? And I think it's really important to think about who you are, because especially today, and to find out, you can do this DNA testing now. People say it's controversial, but I think for me, it's a good thing. I also felt a little bit, like, how can I take the stage with somebody who's writing about other? Am I other? Am I other enough? I have my lived reality. It's always been complicated to talk about myself. Am I on the right stage here? Can I really be mixed race? It's really important to work out who you are.
I want to thank you for being on stage and talking about who you are. Monique is absolutely right. It's very important to think about who we are.
Yeah.
And we can do that by reading books. In particular, this book, The Mermaid of Black Conch. This book, Mixed Other. Both writers will be available in a couple of minutes in Waterstones. A huge, massive Primadonna applause, please, for Monique Roffey and for Natalie. Huge applause. Thank you so much, and thanks for being here.